give me one shot here on a blue chip stock, believe me, Kevin, the only problem you're gonna have is that you didn't buy more.
Nobody knows if the stock is gonna go up, down, sideways, or in circles.
What's going on, NBA Draft fans? Your boys are back. The Wolves of Ball Street, your favorite draft analyst. My name's Corey Tulaba. I am here, as always, with my co-host, Albert, Garbage Time, Gim. Albert, what's up, my man?
We have a lot going on. We are busy as hell, but it's always great to be able to sit in front of a mic and talk about basketball. And we have a special guest today, which is always freaking great. And we've been having a lot of great guests, Corey, but today we have a very special one, and I'm really excited to talk draft. Can't believe how deep in the weeds we are now with this cycle, but here we are. But I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, friend of the show, repeat customer, making another appearance. We have ESPN's Jeremy Woo with us. Jeremy, thanks for joining us, man. How you doing? How you holding up?
I'm good, man. I don't know. I always like this time of year. Like, obviously, the buildup is interesting, but also just like I would say my life is more interesting because I wake up with renewed purpose. You know, like I gotta call people and like write, and like people are actually reading what we're talking about in June. You know, it's like a little bit more of a microscope, but like in a good way. So you know, this is the fun part. So just very curious to see how this is gonna go.
Yeah, you're with a publication that you need to actually write at and isn't turning into a AI farm, right? So that's nice.
Yeah, I can confirm the first part. Yeah, we write a lot, which is good.
Well, I'm excited to chop it up with you. You and Jonathan have been doing a lot of great stuff over at ESPN.com throughout this entire cycle. And recently you guys have been putting out some really interesting pieces. You know, obviously littered with intel, but then also doing some of the fun stuff, you know, the mock drafts, the rankings, and stuff that, you know, we are always big fans of on the NBA Draft Show, which is, you know, like player comps. There's a large section of people who aren't really super into player comps, but I think that they serve multiple purposes because one, when you're trying to talk about a prospect at this time of the year for people that aren't following the draft as a 24/7 cycle like we are, they're looking to be like, well, who is this guy like? Right? Like they're not necessarily going to be spending hours diving into film. They kind of just want the Cliff Notes version of it. So I think, you know, being able to communicate player comps is really beneficial. I also think that when you are evaluating prospects, player comps are beneficial because it gives you a point of reference for somebody who may or may not have actually worked in the league on an NBA floor. So I'm excited to kind of talk about some of the guys that you and Jonathan have talked about and some of the pieces that you've written over the last few weeks. And I think that starting with, you know, talking about your player comps and also merging the other article where you guys did superlatives for the draft, I feel like this draft, the main guy that people want to know about is Alex Sarr. You know, he was an OTE product. He played in Perth this past year, and he was given the unicorn, you know, the potential unicorn label in the superlatives piece because he's one of these 7'1", you know, kind of do it all, wingy, big, shoot, shot block, defend, all that stuff. But then he also has some interesting player comps. So let's talk about Alex Sarr and, you know, what is kind of the likelihood of where he kind of ends up and just his game and what you think about his game.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. He's been an interesting one all year. Obviously, like started off, you know, with those big games in Vegas, and I don't know. I think the upside with Sarr has always been pretty easy to see. The conversation around him, I think, has been very interesting because I think it's fair to say, like at OTE, he was not like, you know, I was among many people sort of going in and out of OTE for particularly those like, you know, a couple years when they were first sort of getting off the ground with the Twins, and it wasn't like he was like lighting it up. But big guys take a really long time, and I remember. I can't say exactly like when this was, but I think it was like towards the end of, it must have been 22, the end of that season. And I came back and I'm walking into their gym and there's just like huge guy there. I'm like, oh, that's Sarr. Like it was like, looked like he had gotten like twice as large, just like physically. So like you see that and it's like, oh, okay, this is a little different. So obviously the tools are pretty unique. And I think this is the point that I've sort of made all season with him. Like I think even if you're a little bit lower on maybe how realistic it is that he gets there, I think that if you think there's a chance, I mean, it's hard to find players who kind of do the things that he does in any draft, no matter how good or deep the draft is. So like in a normal draft, he's probably more of like a mid to late lottery name. But this is, we can only pick from what is on the board. So I get it. Like I get why he's a top name. And yeah, I mean, again, my confidence is kind of depends on what day it is that I'm watching, but like some of the stuff he does is pretty unique.
Yeah, I was also like the first time I saw him was at an OT event against like a all-star group of New Jersey high school prospects, talented guys, who were high major players, and he obviously stands out when you see him just because of how tall he is and whatnot. But he was like shooting threes and like settling for outside shots and hitting the side of the backboard and shooting air balls. And I was like, I get it, but this is not for me. And then I saw him at the pro day like a month later and I'm like, all right, this stuff is cool, but like these are drills and there's no defenders. So like, I get it, but how do we see this materialize? So yeah, I was a little shocked when he came out in those OTE or in those Ignite games, like you said, and like came out and looked incredible. And, I've spoken to some people around the league. They're like, I think people maybe overreacted to those when it happened because people didn't realize that this Ignite team was going to be like one of the worst, basketball teams that you could watch. But what really kind of impressed me about Sarr more than anything, because I think even, you see the unicorn type stuff, him grabbing and going and, taking the ball to the hoop from the perimeter, all that stuff. I feel like in the playoffs for Perth, he kind of like fell back more into the role where you can kind of see what his floor would look like if none of that stuff materializes, where he was not taking necessarily bad threes, or he was just kind of playing a more like neutered game offensively, but then he was still doing all of those interesting things defensively. And that's kind of where I was like, okay, I can see him like playing a winning brand of basketball, even if he doesn't ultimately turn into a guy like Jaren Jackson, who is, your high end comp. So your low end comp was Nick Claxton. So how did you kind of get to these player comps for your piece?
Yeah, so when I do the comps, like it's never really like one-to-one, but I try to think of it more from like I try to like start with like the role and then try to like find names that kind of like fit. I used to hate doing the comparisons because it's just like I think you have to accept that they will get taken out of context.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I just try to like write the context and like hopefully you read the article, and if you don't, like it's not my problem. So that's kind of how I approach it. You just kind of got to accept that people are going to be grumpy about what you're saying. But yeah, I mean, I think to your point, the defensive growth I think is pretty real. I know they were pretty happy with him in Perth with the way he improved this season. I feel pretty secure that like defensively he's going to be a good NBA player. Like I don't know, when you're that big and you can move like that and you offer some scheme versatility, and I think just sheer size really matters. Like, I know we talk about small ball a lot, but like having guys who allow you to play big, but have like enough skill to sort of function in a way that is a little more versatile. I mean, those guys are not easy to find. So again, it's going to take him, I think, another couple years offensively, at least to sort of even scratch the surface. So like it might be, something we have to be patient about. And that's something that we're not good at right now. Like I think culturally with our sports discourse is not always good about being patient with young players in any sport. but yeah, I mean, I think if he gets anywhere close to what Jackson is, like, I'm not saying he's going to win Defensive Player of the Year, but like, if he can be like a facsimile of that, that's pretty good. And again, there's not that many of those guys just like lying around. So that's kind of where I'm at with him.
I think the point about, well, first off, like these comps, they all feel pretty fair to me. And I think even on the low end, if we look at a guy like Nick Claxton, who is about to be a free agent and is probably going to demand a pretty good amount of money with the skill set that he has with the rebounding and the screen setting and all that stuff. I just feel like this is kind of a really good image of like what this draft is really going to look like. I think Sarr. I had a buddy when I was in SF. He's a really big Hawks fan, and he was like, "Dude, tell me about this kid Sarr." And I was like, "Well, what do you want to hear?" And he's like, "Well, I want to know, is he going to be a star, right?" And this is kind of what we're going to hear a lot of, especially from people who are fans of the Hawks, who are looking at the first overall pick and maybe aren't super in tune with what this class is like, and they're going to want to know, are they getting a star in their hands? And I think the comps that you gave kind of speaks a little bit to that, where I think some people might look at Jaren Jackson and be like, yeah, he's kind of a star, but he's also not like a marquee name type of star, right? But I feel like with this class, with Sarr and a lot of these guys, I do feel like, and I wanted to ask this, Jeremy, like I feel like the top three guys, to even that, like I've changed my top three so many times this cycle. Even now, like I don't even know if I'm like rock solid set on my top three guys, but I think overall there is this theme of like we're probably not going to get some superstar out of this class, clearly, but I think if we temper our expectations a little bit and come down to earth and realize like, oh, we might get a Jaren Jackson type of guy, or for Clingan, you'd put high-end Rudy Gobert or late career Brook Lopez, Walker Kessler. For Risacher, you said high-end Chris Middleton, right? Low-end Trey Murphy. These are all like really good NBA players that have had either long careers or are about to have long careers. How do you feel overall? Like, okay, if someone came to you and was like, 5 years, 10 years down the line, right? When it comes to either a Sarr or Risacher or Clingan, whatever, at the very top, how do you feel like people are going to feel about this class 10 years from now? Do you feel like it's just going to be disappointment, or you think people are going to be like, look, like we tried to set the expectation of what this class is going to be, and it's probably very realistic that we get there?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think, I don't know. I mean, if I had to guess, I mean, I think there's just an element of like, well, I'd say the draft that we've brought up kind of all year and people have brought up to me is 2013, right? Which also the discourse around that was that it was super weak. The order and what happened, this is a little bit before I was covering the draft, really, so I don't remember it as well. But just I think the nature of that being uncertain, and then you look back, and again, there was a few all-stars there. They're still good role players. It was a role player heavy draft, but like, guys always emerge. And so like, I think the difference between like, I don't think this is a bad draft. I just think it's a very difficult draft at the top. Because there's just not, when it's not obvious, it's a challenge. And,
Right.
But I think I said this on like Windhorse podcast, like back in the fall or in the winter. It was like, a bad draft. It's more a referendum on like what the current level is, but it doesn't necessarily mean, projecting out like it's going to be bad. It's just like the level of polish maybe on the top guys, or like maybe the archetypes that we're talking about here are not like, superstar players. But like, I don't know. The other thing with comps too, which I think that's valuable over time, is like, I also think about like when I'm comparing someone to a player, like where was that player when they were, 19? Like, people were yelling about the Trey Murphy thing for Risacher, but it's like, well, Trey Murphy, when he was 18, was like going to Rice and was like not playing, he was like a mid to, low mid major, or sorry, mid to low high major recruit going to Rice. And he ended up transferring and he broke out, but it was like a non-linear situation, right? So like, Risacher is way ahead of that, and he's just because he's not shooting it amazing when he's playing a packed schedule doesn't mean he's not going to be a good shooter. Like I'm pretty sure he's going to shoot. So like, I just think those are all type of things we have to keep in mind. So back to your question, like my guess is there'll be some pleasant surprises out of this class. Like I don't hate it. It's just the expected value out of the top picks is just I think the confidence level that we have is just maybe not as high in that.
If Risacher ends up where like you could be like his floor is Trey Murphy, teams need to run to the podium. Like
Yeah.
Trey Murphy is
That's a useful
freaking
player.
awesome.
Yeah, and
Like-
Trey Murphy doesn't dribble, you know.
he's so good. And the parallels are easy to see, obviously. Like I remember when I was at Hoop Summit, I remember seeing Risacher up close, and I was like, this dude is gigantic. Like he's huge. And I think a lot of times when like the players that are playing at various spots overseas, when you're watching their film, sometimes you don't realize like the guys that they're playing against are also gigantic. So it in some ways it doesn't, it kind of tempers how big you think they are. But like, yeah, if Risacher is like a 6'9.5", 6'10" in shoes guy who's shooting at high volume and defends like he does, I think that's really valuable. And when we look at whether it is Sarr or it's a Risacher, or maybe, we've heard rumblings of Clingan even, do you have, any kind of feeling as to which direction Atlanta might be leaning here? Because if they don't, like I've heard, they're going to blow it up. But if that blow up doesn't involve San Antonio, right, who they owe picks to, it doesn't make a ton of sense for them to just kind of bottom out and be bad, because it wouldn't really benefit them given the draft capital that they owe. So have you do you have like a gut feeling on the direction that they're going to go? Like, do they want to go potential? Do they want to lean production? Like, what do you think about the Hawks at 1?
Yeah, it's super interesting. Like the fact that they won the lottery, obviously, like I don't know that they necessarily know for sure yet what they're doing, and like that's not uncommon. Like if I remember, like a few years ago, like Orlando, I don't think they decided who they were taking until like a week before, really. If maybe even later than that. I never got a straight answer, but I think it's going to be a process for sure. And they were, obviously preparing to pick 9th or 10th. So all of a sudden you got to really think, maybe the guys you thought you didn't have to scout as hard, now you really have to talk about it. So like, I don't have an amazing read on like what direction they'll go, but I do think it is interesting. Like you said, you make a good point about the dynamic with, the Spurs having their picks. Like, if the Spurs do want to get to 1, like they might not have to use 8. If they want to, for example, keep 8, and they were like, oh, hey, we'll offer you one of these, your future picks back to go from 4 to 1. I mean, that's Atlanta probably has to think hard about that if they like someone they can go back and get. So it really depends not only on your board, but like how, where do you draw the line of separation where like, if you're thinking about it in terms of tiers, like, how many players would you consider number 1 worthy and like be happy to walk away with, and how far back can you go to like still get a guy like that, right? So that's probably what they're thinking. Traditionally, it's very hard to trade back from 1 just because I think the optics are always challenging. It's hard to explain why you're doing it, and then if you do it and it doesn't go well, it just looks bad. So like, I don't know. And if I'm San Antonio too, like I'm pretty comfortable probably just taking 2 swings. It's probably the way to go. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't rule anything out. I mean, I think those 3 guys are probably in the mix, and if they trade back, it probably opens up the conversation a little bit more. If they go back to like 4 or 5, I expect a guy like Castle or like Cody Williams. Like those are kind of the players that they need, and I would guess if they go back, like a bigger defensive type wing is probably interesting to them. So I don't know. I don't have a clear window into what they're doing, but I think the whole NBA is kind of waiting because it's, with this process, it's kind of like you start at the top and you work down, and it's a little harder to do when it's unsettled. Yeah.
I think just to kind of, I know we've talked a lot more about the Hawks than I think we were expecting to, but just to I did want to ask about Clingan though, because I know you guys dropped that mock draft today, where it looks like Jonathan he for the pick that he feels the biggest need, he put Donovan Clingan, and I think Clingan is a guy who coming into the season, obviously there were some concerns with the injuries, but he had an unbelievable season. He got better as the season progressed. I think he looked healthier, and then once we got into the tournament, he was incredible, right? And it seems like with the way that his season ended and all of that, and the success that they had, his draft stock seems to be climbing up and up, right? And now even with the mock draft that you guys dropped today, now suddenly Clingan's in that conversation, and maybe suddenly is not the right word, right? But he's in that conversation, and I think, in my opinion, I think he definitely deserves to be so, right? With when I think about Clingan, like he's gigantic, right? I believe without shoes, he measured in at 7'1.5" at the combine. So with shoes, we're talking about a 7'3" center, right? And he's not only is he gigantic and he can control the paint and be a rim deterrent and all that, but also I think he flashed some upside on the offensive side as well. So I guess my question is, now that it seems like Clingan is a real option there at 1 for the Hawks, if you can give us some insight on how teams are feeling about Clingan, or more importantly, how you're feeling about Clingan and him being in that conversation as a potential number 1 pick.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, I think it was, he really obviously benefited, I would say probably the most from what happened towards the end of the season, because he was, I think, healthier. I mean, he was pretty amazing in the NCAA tournament defensively. And just showing, what he could kind of be when he was, it kind of depended what day you saw him during the season. Like, when I saw him, he wasn't at full strength, I don't think, just observationally. So like when you frame it this way and you know how huge he is, and like, there's just not a ton of guys with those measurements. One of the things I like about him too is I think he has a really good mentality. Like, I think he's tough. I don't think he likes, getting scored on. Like, I think he has kind of the right level of like quiet, sort of I don't know if it's nastiness, but like, I think he just has a good disposition, to be that guy. And I don't know. I think there's just untapped stuff with him. So I don't know how realistic it is that he shoots anytime soon. Maybe he'll get there. It takes time to do it in a game, but I do think he's someone who is, in that conversation pretty high. I know there are teams that have him top 3. I think like, my guess would be, we've written this too, but if you look at how the draft order shaped up, like, if he doesn't go 1 and he doesn't go 2, if we say that Risacher and Sarr, go 1 and 2 in some order, then I think that, 3 kind of becomes an interesting trade spot. Knowing that I think Houston is a team that traditionally is willing to, make the value play, and they don't have necessarily pronounced like positional needs, just because they have so many young guys and they're trying to get everybody minutes. And if they do want to come back, that's probably, I think, the guy. Clingan is the guy that I think there will be teams that are interested in moving up. That's maybe where you try to get him. So I think he's one of the more interesting sort of like guys in that range that could sort of change the way the draft goes, depending on where Atlanta lands, and then if he's there at 3, what happens. But yeah, I mean, I've come around on him quite a bit, just because I think his size, his instincts, like there's just a lot to like, and he's still pretty young, and is like, if he can stay healthy, which is always a concern with guys that big, but if he can stay healthy and also stay in shape to be able to play at this level, I mean, it's pretty interesting. So I don't know. I think if you think he has, upside to be, sort of Gobert level defensively, then you can definitely argue it at the top.
And you mentioned, in your piece, as his high end outcome is like potentially like the late Greer Brook Lopez, and we saw how long it took for him. And part of it is the evolution of how the game had changed from when he was drafted into, where it shifted to with the kind of advent of the 3-point era. But it took Brook Lopez a long time to become, Splash Mountain. There's a guy who was mostly a mid post and in kind of guy before he extended his range. Clingan is my number 1 prospect right now. Like, he's a guy I've seen a lot over the last couple of years. And last year, we were kind of like, let's temper some expectations, because he's playing like 15 minutes a game. And like, it's easy to like go after every block when you don't have to worry about foul trouble and everything. And then I saw him early in the year, and what stood out the most, and he still only played like 20 minutes at that point, but what stood out was like, there's some real playmaking from him at his size. And I think now, like, we've seen how important it is for bigs to have kind of that level of feel on offense too, especially a big who is going to not step onto the floor day one and be able to stretch it out. Like, to be able to, set a good screen, up top, and then, but to, short roll and make a pass, or run a DHO from out on the perimeter and be able to hit cutters. To me, I think that's kind of the most like under discussed aspect of his game. And then you add in all the defensive capabilities. Like, the fact that he's a winner, I think, we saw him play more minutes as the season went along. And the fact that UConn was loaded and they had good depth at that position, he never really had to be a guy like a Zach Edey who was like on the floor for 40 minutes, in a big spot. And the fact that a lot of times UConn was like dominating teams, but just what he brings, floor and then an under discussed ceiling. Cause like, I think that you could make an argument that like his shooting is as theoretical as any these other guys who are shooting 25% from three, like for them to get to the next spot. And his shot looks pretty good. So I multiple time, NCAA champion, winner. I think that he's going to be, he's kind of like a wild card piece. And I see him dropping in a lot of these mocks and like, making it to 7 and you understand why, because, teams might be thinking about positional fit. And for him, I kind of wonder, like, is a Mark Williams, is a Jalen Duren, like, are those pieces from what we've seen from them? Do you think that those are like pieces where you go, you know what, I can't draft a center if you think that Clingan could ultimately be like a Rudy Gobert level prospect?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the right question. At what point, and this is something, it's hard for us to say, not knowing, exactly what teams know and are planning long-term. But I think that's the question is he better than what we have? Do we care if, this pick cannibalizes maybe a little bit of the development of who we have? Because the other thing too is, when you stack two of those guys, it's sometimes harder to, trade and get good value if teams know you can't. If you take Clingan and you've still got Mark Williams, it's like, well, hey, we're going to call you. Hey, how much is Mark Williams? It's like, we don't need him as bad. So these are all dynamics I think are interesting. But my guess would be someone should, and I think someone should go up and get him. And to your point too, I think the value of having someone that big where you're not really playing 4-on-5 offensively, like he can play out of a lot of different spots. Like that's something I say a lot, but like with centers, we don't say it as much. But like, I don't know. I think he can do more than your typical, 7'2", 7'3" guy in terms of passing and moving and just like having some feel for how to do that. So, some of that will depend on coaching too. Yeah. Does your coach have a sense of what to do with them? And that's also, a big thing with fit. Like how do you want to play? So, gonna be an interesting one to see. But yeah, I'm with you. I think, for me, I changed my stance on him. I had him kind of like late lottery. And then I sort of saw how the rest of the season went. It's like, I feel like fairly good that this is like a pretty good player. So. Yeah.
Shout out to everybody watching live. Shout out to everybody in the chat on YouTube, everybody watching live on Twitter. Next guy I want to kind of talk about, another guy. To go back to earlier when you're saying like, this is a good draft, like there's a lot of prospects that have all these interesting qualities about them, but you look at a guy like Reed Sheppard and, he looks like a character on Leave It to Beaver and you kind of go, I don't know if I could see it. And, but he's 6'3", not super long wingspan. But then, in the article, the first article that, we referenced with the superlatives, he's the best spot up shooter in the draft. And then, in the piece that you wrote with the comps, like his high end comp, Steve Nash, low end, Peyton Pritchard. Peyton Pritchard's a guy who's getting minutes in the finals. Pretty healthy low end. And when you look at his outlier production, like he's the first guy since, was it Glenn Rice, I think, to shoot 50% from three. All right. Like Glenn Rice played a long time ago. So, and not on small volume, like Reed Sheppard was, getting him up, maybe not at the level of like Isaiah Joe was when he was in college, but he was shooting a healthy diet. So when we look at a guy like Reed Sheppard, what do we think, his ceiling is as far as where he goes in this draft? And what do we think his floor is? Because, it's hard for small guards to survive in today's NBA, but also when you have that kind of outlier shooting potential, those kind of concerns kind of go out the window a little bit.
Yeah. I would guess his range is probably, I think it's somewhat narrow. I think it's 3 to 6, like in that range. I think all those teams will we'll look at him. If Houston keeps the pick, look, we know for a fact he's demolishing like analytics models. Like he's crushing it. Like pretty unique level of shooting season, and like it took me a little while to kind of come around on him, frankly. Just kind of just because of like the eye test stuff. It's like, is that guard in that mold? Is it really what you want with the top 5 pick? But again, it just comes back to what else is there, and I think, yeah, I mean I think any one season sample can be argued as a small sample, right? But it's pretty impressive, like what he did, and I don't know, like I came away as I kind of reviewed. Kentucky was the team I probably have done the most like work on after the fact, just because they were the hardest to figure out and they had so many prospects, I think. But I just came away like feeling pretty confident that he's good, and like there's a baseline when you're a good player and you like know how to play and you have a potentially elite skill, and like I don't know, he's not going to be amazing defensively, but he gets the most out of it, right? Like, look, I don't think I would be surprised, like for example, if his block rate, like, are his blocks going to translate in the NBA? I mean, probably not. It's okay if they don't. I don't think we can assume it, right? That's not what you're picking him for,
Right.
But just knowing that he's a guy who really does kind of get the most out of his talent, physically, and I think has room to grow skill wise, and also, I just I like with him just the fact that he was not. He was obviously a national recruit, and it was a little bit of a unique case because he didn't have a big open recruitment because of the Kentucky stuff, the ties there. But he didn't get overhyped in the way that sometimes guys do. And I say that like I'm part of this complex that sometimes ranks people too early. It's like it's a challenge for everybody, but like I don't know. I mean, I think there's something to be said for we've seen guys who maybe don't get that validation early. End up having these later, pretty impressive development curves, and they end up being way better than we thought. Whether that's some intangible motivation or just, there's not like a uniform reason for it, but like I do think that there's a pattern of sometimes these guys who, aren't the ones who we expect, like end up on these unique pathways. So I wouldn't rule out, like I don't think he's Steve Nash, but like I wouldn't rule out him being a really good player. So it's tough. I mean, that was one of the harder players for me to make my mind up on, but I've ended up on the side of it's worth a shot.
I think it's pretty normal. I mean, we kind of get this a lot with these Kentucky teams. They just bring in a lot of these guys, and so it's hard sometimes to see how they kind of mesh together, and the context that they're in makes it a little bit difficult to evaluate, I think. But I think to your point, Jeremy, I think with Reed, like just I get it. Like, there's probably gonna be a little bit of a dip kind of all across the board because, like you said, it was a small sample size. But just from what we saw and eye test, and like even if we just isolate the shooting, like the shot looks great. He took a lot of them, right? He made a lot of them, and I think that means something. And defensively, yeah, the block rate will come down, stuff like that. But I still think that defensive playmaking is going to be in there, right? Like as a part of who he is, because like you said, I think it's a lot of it is also the way that he thinks the game. I think he's a really smart player and he's able to leverage. Yeah, like he is a little bit smaller, doesn't have a great wingspan, but I think he's more athletic than people give him credit for. And also he can think the game, right? So him being able to, have that high IQ and to leverage his strengths rather than, letting his weaknesses kind of take over. I think he does a really good job of that. And so if baseline, he's going to be a really smart player that's going to shoot the ball really well and then potentially might have some more juice on the ball than maybe he was able to show last season, considering the team that he was on and the players that they, Calipari kind of gave the keys to. I think it's there's plenty of reason to get excited or also, just to have a little bit more enthusiasm about his game than others might have. Right. So I totally get that. And along the lines of what you said, right? Any player, one season, you get to kind of take that as a small sample size. Another player, only one season, right? And also played a very specific role for a very successful team. I think right now, Stephon Castle is number one on my board, right? And like I said earlier, that could change. I can have a bad lunch and then change how I feel about it later. But for now, I think he's there just because I think he's such an interesting player. And we've talked about it a ton at No Ceilings about, he came in, veteran-laden team for UConn, played a very specific role, wasn't really given the keys to the offense, but was a guy who in high school was able to show off a little bit of the playmaking and had the ball in his hands a little bit more. But, at least like baseline, we know what he's really good at. He's going to be a really, really good defender and a guy who, as a wing, it's kind of a question mark, right, in terms of what type of player he's going to become. And of course, there are a lot of different factors, right? Like just straight up what type of talent he has, also what type of context he ends up in, the coaching system, roster, all that stuff. I get all that, but wanted to ask you how you're kind of feeling about Castle as we get closer to the draft, just because he really can be kind of like this swing guy in terms of how people feel about him, because like Sheppard is a 1-year type of guy and was in a very specific context. So wanted to kind of get your thoughts on Castle and where you see him ending up, and like just how you feel about his game overall.
Yeah. Castle, he's another guy who I sort of had a hard time with, but kind of like for different reasons. I think for me, it was like a little bit colored by just the opportunity that I had to see him before college. It was like probably 2 or 3 different times. I was a little bit underwhelmed then, and so I wasn't really sure like what to expect. He's grown since then. I think obviously like the size factor is pretty huge. And I don't really have that many questions defensively at all. I don't think that's a hard one, right? I mean, he can really move. He does a good job. Like if he gets beat, he stays attached. He can like pursue. Like I think defensively is going to be really good. The role he was playing was pretty valuable, and I think they did a good job of sort of like mitigating him having to create too much. Which in the context of what they were trying to do, which is win the title, I get it. So like. The question I have is just really like how much of it, like, I think it's just a different level of, I mean, UConn's staff is great. So like, I think, they put these guys in positions to like make the reads, and what the reads are. And it's like, I think for him, it sort of helps to simplify. Like there were very few times I watched UConn where it was ever like, hey, Castle, you have to like go create a shot with like 5 seconds left. I don't have a good feel. Like, is he going to do that? Like, I don't know. Right. And that's, to be a point guard, you kind of have to be able to do that. So that's sort of where some of my questions are at with him. Like what's the offensive upside? But even if it turns out he doesn't have that, I don't know. I mean, I think he's a version of what, when we were talking about the Thompson twins last year, it's kind of a version of that role. Like, probably a little bit more. He's not as athletic as either guy. He's pretty athletic. He's not as like, I mean, those guys are crazy athletes, but like, can he do sort of like what a Sarr Thompson did, which, was up and down, but like had some good flashes. And I think he's going to play in the NBA for a long time. Can he do that? Like, yeah, he can probably do a version of that. So it's just a matter to me of like where you want that. I probably don't I've seen enough. I'm not like sold enough on the offense for me to like take him at 1, but like, I understand the argument. So that's kind of where I'm at with him. Like, I think, top 5, you can justify it, probably should be in the top 10. But yeah, I'm curious to see how it turns out with his offense. And I don't know. I mean, he plays hard. It sometimes looks like he's not playing hard because he's just kind of like a flat personality, which is something that I was struggling with too. I saw him and it was just like, I wish he would have fun, but we can't make, we got to judge people by what they're doing in the game. And I think, I think he proved that he is competitive and does do that stuff. So I don't question that so much.
Now, how much truth is there to the, like, he is telling teams that he only wants to be a point guard and he's only working out for teams that are going to let him be a point guard? Because it's such a weird even conversation to have, because there are so few pure point guards in what this version of the NBA looks like. Like Luka dominates the ball all the time. He can obviously make all the point guard reads, but he's 6'9", and like, he plays next to Kyrie, who you'd probably think is the point guard, but he's not really the point guard. Like for the Celtics, it's like, I don't know, they kind of share all the ball handling duties. So whether he is or he isn't, he might have enough of the passing, enough of the ball handling and all of that, right, to just kind of still be effective in whatever role that is. But how much truth is there to him, like, trying to, or is it just posturing on his end to get to a spot where he feels like he's going to have the most opportunity to, grow into this player that he envisions? And when he gets there, he's going to still be willing to do all the stuff that he did at UConn, which is just do the winning things with not a lot of ego, but he also wants the opportunity to kind of grow into who he thinks he can potentially become.
Yeah, I mean, I know that's been communicated. Again, what is said a month before the draft. Sometimes people change their stance on things like that. Once you kind of see how the board is going to fall, right? So I don't know specifically, whether or not that is like a super salient thing. I do think they are. I know if actually, they aren't sending him everywhere to work out. So it's, I think where he ends up working out, in 2 weeks when we try to figure out, where is he gone, I think that will probably tell you something about what the range is. So I think that's what I would be more keyed in on in terms of like, what is really happening in his pre-draft. That's what I'm more curious about as I sort of try to sniff this out versus, the point guard thing. And I get why you'd say something like that. But I think you make a great point too. Like think about, what Boston is doing. They don't, Drew and Derek White are both, kind of point guards, kind of combos, both great defenders. I mean, can Castle be that type of player? Like if he shoots it well enough, like, yeah, he could play a role like that. So, yeah, I don't worry so much about that. But is he going to be like an ISO guy? Like, I don't expect that will happen. No.
Do you think there's a chance that a team who he doesn't work out for is just like, well, I don't care like what you did in an empty gym one-on-one. Like I saw what you did on the path to this title as a freshman, and we're willing to bet on that, even though we haven't been able to get you into the gym.
Yeah, I mean, someone could take him. I mean, with the new stuff with the medicals, it's harder for agents to, if you want to steer a guy somewhere, it's a little bit harder to do it, because you can't withhold the medicals. So, or at least to a certain point, you'd have to go back and look at the exact, it's all public, how they distribute it. So we know now, who's going to have what info for those guys. But yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting one to figure out. And, will they try to steer him somewhere anyway? Maybe. But again, it's early to call.
Now, speaking of, injuries, Nikola Topic, kind of came out that he's got a partially torn ACL. Does that affect his draft stock at all? Because I think we've seen players, especially young players, come back from injuries, especially like this injury in particular, a lot better than maybe they did when Derrick Rose suffered it, and it seemed like it was the end of the world when it happened. So is Topic and, his play, the fact that he played in different contexts, he had this crazy production, even though he has a short wingspan, it's short for somebody who's 6'7", not short for a point guard. How much do you think that knee injury is going to weigh into how much teams are willing to take a risk on him and maybe redshirt a year, or does he just drop because teams want to get a player who's more ready to go right away?
Yeah, that one is very, I think, case by case, right? Team doctors are all going to have different opinions of what the information says, and so some of that will be, do we have sign off to take him? The other question is, are we okay if he, from what we know about his availability, like, are we okay if he sits out a year? Certain teams probably have more ability to do that than others. So that's a factor, right? It's, not only how do you value him healthy, but then, how does that information change? What your priorities are in the short term. Like, do you need someone who's going to play next year? Is it close enough that you would take the healthier player? Like, these are all, the things that are, from our perspective, it's hard to say, it comes down to each front office differently.
Jeremy, I just wanted to say, like you mentioned it before, a team like the Spurs, right? They've got picks at 4 and 8. And you said before, like, maybe that's a team that they should just be taking shots, right? And I do wonder, is Topic, a guy that they should 100% be targeting, just because, like you said, I know, like, everyone, because of the season that Wembanyama, that Victor had in his rookie year, everyone's kind of like, you got to build a contender around him right now, right? The window is now. You got to spend all the money and do everything you can. But I do wonder, if you have 2 picks in the top 10 like this, even with an injury like the one that Topic has, don't you feel like the Spurs should be prime candidates to take a look at someone like Topic because of the playmaking, the positional size, his ability to get to the rim, the success he's had overseas. Was wondering how you feel about the Spurs taking a shot at him at one of those picks.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. I think any and all San Antonio hypotheticals are very interesting, just because I think, the bandwidth that having Victor gives you to kind of like build out different types of styles and personnel is super interesting, right? So it kind of depends on like what each of us, what our preferred vision would be. I think it's something they should consider. I mean, it kind of depends. Again, it's like if they do feel like they want to sort of up the ante next season, you're probably not doing that with a rookie point guard anyway. So like, I think, how do you address the guard stuff? Is there a veteran that makes sense that you can get? Like, all those things have to be in consideration. I don't know. I mean, I've kind of been between two minds on him, because I really like, I think it's obvious, how smart of a player he is, and the size, and people have compared him to like Josh Giddey type of guy, and even if he's not a PG, can he be that type of like secondary playmaking wing? Sure. Then again, Josh Giddey was again not a 1-to-1 comp, but he couldn't play the whole time in the playoffs because of the shooting stuff. It was difficult for spacing. So I think it comes down to that, and I do think there was a little bit more maybe like divisiveness on him like around the season. Like he wasn't like a consensus like top 5 pick at any point. Like there are people who were into him and people who weren't, and I've talked to European scouts who were surprised that he was viewed quite that high at a certain point. So like it's all kind of depends on how your board is. I don't know. I mean, for the Spurs, also the other factor, and that's why it makes it sort of a hard question to answer, is if you assume they're keeping 2 picks, well, what are the 2 picks that like best work in concert in terms of like fitting together and providing the most value? And I think it's one of the more fun storylines is will they take 2 guys, and which 2 guys will they get, and how will they do it, or will they trade? And I don't know. I mean, the lottery kind of swings around those 2 picks. So
now every year we kind of see somebody who is projected earlier on consensus mocks slide a little bit on draft night. Last year Cam Whitmore was the guy, he fell all the way to 20. Part of that I think was medicals, but there was a lot of talk before he didn't have great workouts or interviews, stuff like that. Is there anybody that has kind of been projected in that top 10, maybe even lotto range, that you think might slide out on draft night?
Yeah. I mean, I think I would say the player that I am most curious about right now is Rob Dillingham in terms of where he goes. Because I think if you really go through the board in terms of like who needs him, and who would be able to sort of take a chance, like upside with him, it's like not a super long list of teams that necessarily like need a scoring guard like that. So again, to some extent, this is going to be informed by everyone's own optimism or lack of on what he's going to be. Like I know people who around the NBA who have him outside the top 20, and I know people who have him as a top 10 pick. So it depends on what you think he's going to be. And yeah, I mean, I'll put it this way: like if the Spurs don't take him with either of their picks, like I could see scenarios where he falls a little bit. So like he's one. I think we've written plenty that I think Ron Holland is kind of more in the like late lottery to like teens range than he is top 10. It's kind of how it seems to be shaking out right now. So those 2 guys are names that might be following, but then at the same time you have like Devin Carter. His name's really hot right now. Like he seems to be, I think for good reason, someone people are comfortable with. So like when guys fall, it's because other guys are going back the other direction.
Rising. Yeah. Let's talk about the G League Ignite guys a little bit, because I mean, they had such a weird season, and maybe that wasn't the entire contributing factor to it, but it went so south that the program has now folded in its entirety. So, you mentioned Ron as a guy, he might drop a little bit. You compared him high end, kind of RJ Barrett, right? Like downhill driver, trying to win on strength and around the basket, and low end Josh Jackson. this was a guy who came into the year as a potential number 1 pick. He, like Sarr, had like a pretty good game in Vegas that everyone was like, oh, all right, like maybe the shot comes around, scoring wing. What is has the fact that they didn't win games kind of led to that slide? Because, if you just looked at the raw production from Holland, near 20 points a game, good rebound, stock numbers, stuff like that, you'd kind of think a team would maybe want to take a shot on him. But, we continuously see, and at No Ceilings, we've been, obviously, a part of that. He has fallen in that kind of back end of the lottery range all year. So what is it about Holland that teams are maybe a little dubious of comparatively to some of the other guys that are kind of rising?
Well, I think I would say, like, I'll put it this way. I think there is a pretty decent like floor with him, just because when you've got pretty good tools and athleticism and you play pretty hard, which I think he does. In high school, he certainly was sort of more of a defensive, tough, versatile player. And that's sort of why I use RJ Barrett. Like, hasn't had the type of career that some people thought he might in terms of being like a top scorer, but is still very productive because he plays hard and works hard, and like RJ has always done that. So I think with Ron too, it's just one thing, and this is not just Ignite, this is just the G League in general. The production is just always, I think, inflated because you get a lot of high possession games. Sometimes they're just blowouts and like everyone's trying to score and get points, and it's just a very, I'm sure people have better data on this than me just saying it, but like I do think stats can get a little bit inflated, by just the pace and just the volume, and like they gave him the ball a lot. Like he was kind of that was the decision that he was going to kind of be playmaker, and so I think that makes it actually a trickier eval almost, because he's not going to be that in the NBA. If you draft Ron and you're like, hey Ron, you're going to like play on the ball a lot, like you're going to lose a lot. Like it just happened. We just saw them lose a lot doing it. He's just he can pass, but his decision making, like the endpoints sometimes of the plays that he makes, are not always. And again, most guys who are 19 don't have like the There's Luka Doncic comes like once every 50 years. You can't just like slide in and do that usually when you're that age with the ball, with volume. But it just makes it harder, because if you're like, well, if he's off the ball, he doesn't shoot it that great. Like, what does that look like? And I almost think there maybe wasn't enough, not a great like chance to see him play in that role. So you kind of have to calibrate for that as well. So I don't know. I mean, I think he's worth a shot. Like, I think he will be productive. But I think that sort of contributed to the slide too. Like, it's not just the losing, but just the fact that like, the production came in the context of a role that probably isn't 1-to-1, at least in my mind when I look, when I watched his tape and saw them live. So
I think the conclusion that you're coming to, though, right, where you're like, I think he'll be productive. I think there's a huge difference between us thinking a prospect's going to be productive and us thinking that a prospect should go top 5 in a class, right? And I think what you're saying in that conclusion that you're coming to speaks volumes about why Holland is slipping. And I think it's hard to have this discussion about Holland and not also think about Modest Buzelis, right? Because I look at Buzelis, right? And for both of these guys, I dropped them so much on my board that I found myself like kind of correcting myself a little bit because of what you just said as well. And I was thinking the same thing where, yeah, I'm being really harsh on them for sure. And they played in some really ugly games where sometimes they were losing by more than 50 points. But also like, because they were in that context, maybe like I need to cut them a little bit of slack. And so like with Holland, I have him at like 23 now. Buzelis, I have at like 18. But I wanted to have a conversation about Buzelis because with him, I think a lot of people, the sales pitch with Buzelis is he's big, 6'10", pretty much. And then the next thing I think usually people say is, well, he's big and he's going to shoot it, right? My only thing is he did not shoot it for the G League Ignite this season. He really struggled with his jumper. Also, I think like any potential outlook that people might have for him with on ball equity type of stuff too, I feel like he's just as far away as Ron Holland is, in my opinion, if not even more. And once again, like, I know I'm being harsh, but wanted to ask a question because I think they need to be kind of looped in together if we're talking about Ron Holland. I think Buzelis being in the same context, in the same situation, I think he's a guy that is going to have to improve a lot. And he's got a lot of work to do for him to eventually become the type of prospect that I think people think he already is, in my mind. So was wondering where you are with Buzelis and what you've seen from him and how you feel like NBA teams are talking about him and viewing him as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think he's one that, again, it kind of depends almost what day you saw him. But I think for me, it's kind of come down to this is the point that I was going to make with the context of Ron Holland too, is like often some of the guys that I've seen sort of not pan out or sort of not be as good as you think. It's the guys who were like super, super physically strong and fast at a young age, were able to kind of rely on that and then don't add, right? Like Jaylen Brown is a great case of he had the physical tools, but got like way better. But there's always guys who struggle to make that adjustment when you lose the size and speed advantage. So like, with Ron, that's one thing I think is at least some degree of a question you have to ask. With Modest, it's different because I think just physically, he has just not reached his full potential yet. Like, it's not like he's like young. He's not like a young player for a freshman, for a college freshman. But I think that, he did get stronger this year, but he's going to have to keep putting that weight on. He is pretty athletic. Like he's bouncy. Like he's got some of this where, in the game, sometimes it wasn't like super functional. Like his foot speed wasn't like insane, but like, I don't know. I think with the frame he has, once he sort of gets up to that, physical maturity, like I think he could look different. So for me, it's just a little bit more like, I have him top 10. It's more like the optimism around there just being more there. Like, I don't know. Yeah, you're right. He didn't shoot it amazing. But like for what it's worth, like he shot it, okay in high school the year before, like better, based on what numbers we have. And like, I don't know. I think shooting it's just tough. Like it's hard to expect, any teenager to come into a league where you're one of the youngest players and like be a 40% shooter. So I think with shooting, it depends a lot on what your expectations are. And like, you can say the same thing about Risacher too. Like, I think he shot it pretty well, considering what the expectations were coming into the season, and one slump doesn't affect that. So like with Modest, I think he will shoot enough. I'm not saying he's going to be a 40% shooter. But will it be enough to like space and like make plays and be able to play like inside out a little bit? Like there were flashes of shot making for him, too, like some tough shots. And
yeah,
I don't know. I just think there's like more there that is a little bit tough. And again, contextually, like, until Ron sort of shut his season down, like Modest wasn't quite as feature offensively. So it's a difficult context for me.
Yeah, I think being 6'10" probably offers you a little bit more grace for showing maybe that you have some shooting flashes. I think, the intrigue with a guy like Salon too probably says a lot, right? Because, he's pretty inconsistent as a shooter, but if it looks good and it goes in sometimes, a team is probably going to be like, yeah, we could probably make him shoot it to where it goes in a little bit more often, right? Is he kind of the wild card of this whole top 10? He super young guy with this really strong frame, and obviously the intrigue of him having this long season where he came on pretty strong and had some moments of extreme confidence in playoff games at that age, like logo 3 type stuff. Is he kind of the wild card in this whole situation?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you can really argue the upside if you want to with him. I mean, I think all season, I think some of the stuff that he had on film was pretty interesting, like from summer and like prior, and then his body's filled out. Like I haven't seen him live, but like people I've talked to, it's like he's huge. Like really does have the frame and the tools. And again, I don't know if he's like a great shooter, but he gets them up and it looks pretty confident. He's made some tough shots. So like, again, this just comes back to the point I sort of keep making about like age and like what are our expectations and how do we project? Because that's such a big part of this draft. These guys aren't the most polished, but a lot of them are pretty young. I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot there. I think you can make the argument for Salam pretty high. depending on what your expectations are. Like he reminded me a little bit. I think I wrote this of like Jeremy Grant when I was watching, like sort of the way he moves and like certainly is way ahead of where a guy like that was when he was 18, right? Like that's where comparisons, I'll say it again, like do come in handy. It's like, well, where is this guy relative to where someone else was at the same age? Like, what are they doing? And, I think that's just important context to have too. So yeah, I'm very intrigued by him.
Yeah. Is he somebody that, might end up higher than people might expect? And, on draft night, it's kind of like, oh, that spot. Interesting. Like all of a sudden he's going 6 to Charlotte or something. Does he have the upside to be kind of a guy who cracks the top 5-ish range?
Yeah, it wouldn't totally shock me. I mean, it kind of depends on where they send him. Obviously, I'm curious to sort of see what his workout schedule, fully ends up being. But it wouldn't surprise me. Again, it's all about eye of the beholder and projection and, situationally, like what do you need to swing on? So like, yeah, I mean, a team like Detroit, you could say, oh, maybe we prefer this guy to Montes in theory, or like Charlotte, sort of the same thing. San Antonio, could think about it. Obviously, me and Victor know one another, so like that helps. But like, he also does fit. Like I think he stands on his own 2 legs as like a top 10 prospect. So like, if they pick that, I don't think it's just straight like this is for Victor. It's like this is the really interesting player who happens to also have this other added dynamic. So yeah, he's someone I'll be very interested to see sort of how these next few weeks go.
Speaking of wild cards, I think last year when we had you on our pod, it was kind of like middle of the cycle ish when we had you on. And I think at the time you had dropped a big board and you had Anthony Black at the top. Oh, yeah. And I remember like that was like a big talking point and something that we went over. And it made me think like for this year, obviously we already have so much volatility when we're talking about the top of this draft, but is there someone on your board that you're a little bit higher on than maybe the consensus is, kind of like you were with Anthony Black last year?
Yeah, I think for me, it's ended up being Devin Carter, which is funny because like during the season, I liked him a lot, but I wasn't 100% sure of like where I would take him. But then I don't know. I just think the more you go through this process and like the more certainty that I feel that he's going to be a good player, like I would take him pretty high. Like, I don't know. I think he's athletic enough and like plays hard enough and has like made interesting progress as a shooter. And I don't know. The dude's like a gamer. Like I think it's obviously kind of like a cliche thing to say, but I think it's true. Like I think that's probably when we say it, that's like who we're talking about. So like these type of guys. So I just think the reliability there. I think the floor is super high, and I think there's maybe more offensive upside scoring it than maybe we think. So like, I don't know. Like I when I saw him, I was thinking like Marcus Smart, but I think he's actually a little bit more of a scorer, and maybe a little bit less, purely defensive. So I don't know. I think he's very interesting, and I think the fact he's rising kind of reflects that. And like as I've gone through this, he's sort of the guy to me that stands out.
Yeah, I mean, I saw him live a couple of times, and I had the same impression. Like. And it's funny, because I've always been a little weary of his shot, like, crazy shooting leap after some pretty subpar years, not really a great shooter from any level outside of the 3-point line. I was like, I got to watch him in warmups. Like, I got to see what this looks like even then. And he's missing shots, like open layup line shots. And then first shot of the game that he takes is like 5 feet behind the 3-point line on the left wing, falling out of bounds. And he just nails it. And I'm like, yeah, dude's a gamer, he's just going to find a way. And that obviously like being tangibles. And I think it's interesting because of his size, he'll be like 6'3" in shoes or whatever. Obviously the plus wingspan really helps him be able to guard different positions and do different things. But like, in a different era, he might be like, oh, he's not really a point guard. So it's a weird fit. But going back to, the conversation we were having with Castle, it doesn't really matter now anymore, right? Like, if you look at the version of Devin Carter and what he turns into 7 years from now, like, and you took that player and put him into the Celtics system, you probably look at him and be like, yeah, I think he could, that, finished version of whatever Devin Carter is could probably play on the Celtics right now. Right. So how much does like the fact that, all right, he might not have the sexiest upside, but it's just like, Drew Holiday is probably averaging like 13 points a game or something in the finals, but he's also inarguably one of the most impactful players. Like, how much do you weigh that? And then also, like, is that what teams are weighing with him? Like, he's probably not going to be a 20-point scorer, like leading an offense like he did at Providence, but is he just going to win with his intangibles and at the next level?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the argument. And like, so there's just like it's funny. So like, I live in Chicago. You guys know that. So like, I end up going to a lot of DePaul games, which is kind of depressing. But like, one thing, and they have a new staff, but no shot at DePaul. But like, one thing, and I say this to people, and like, I'm always kind of joking, but also I'm not joking. Is like, one interesting thing about that is you really see who like shows up for the game. Because like, if you're in the Big East, you know, the last few years, you can walk into DePaul and you probably have a good chance to win by 20. Like, they were pretty bad. Devin Carter, when I was there, just like from the first like 5 seconds of the game, is like, I don't remember exactly what happened. I just remember him playing super hard. He scored a bunch. He was talking all shit. Like, just came out just like firing. And so yeah, it's like, see, it's like no one here is watching. Like, it's not a full arena. Like, you don't know who's watching, but like, you're still showing up. I think that's like a big part of what competitiveness is, right? Is it's like, why are you getting up for this game? Do you have to? No, he could coast and they could probably win that game. But I think that says something. So like, I think that's an interesting, you mentioned Charlotte. I think that's an interesting one that I've thought about. Like, if you're Charlotte and you're picking at 6, like, would you rather for next season have Devin Carter or Stephon Castle? Like, maybe long-term Stephon Castle, but like, for what they are right now, if you're trying to make stretch as a team, like, having a guy like that who you don't have, it's like, they're very different personalities, right? Like, Devin's older, plays super hard. Castle's going to take him time to mature into that if he's going to be that. But like, throwing a guy like that in, to your question about intangibles, like, that can change the dynamic of a team. So like, that's something that I would be thinking about, right? And I think that is part of why he's rising. And I do think that would actually be a very interesting pick at number 6 for what it's worth. Just getting someone who's going to change the tone of the team, and he doesn't have to have the ball the whole time. He actually fits really well with LaMelo. So anyway, just an example, but like, when I thought about it like that, it helped sort of reframe, like, where would I actually take him? And it's like, well, I don't think it's going to be negative value,
Well, I think the Charlotte thing's interesting because, new coach, right? Like, coming from Boston. So like, they're trying to build a culture here. Like, that has to be what their goal is. And like, when you have LaMelo, when you have your Brandon Miller, like, your two pieces who were, if LaMelo is a guy that they view there long-term, those two are the guys that you are building the infrastructure of your offense around. So taking an upside swing where you're like, oh, well, this guy might average 20 points a game. It's like, well, not if LaMelo Ball and Brandon Miller are there. Right. Like, so I think one of the under-discussed things with the draft is like, teams also have to consider the team building aspect of it. And I know that there are multiple avenues that you do that with free agency and internal development and all that. But, you do also have to get guys who are going to fit into your culture, fit into your system. And ultimately, like, at a certain point, you can't continuously swing for potential. Now, maybe you look at pick 6 and you go, well, we're picking too high. We have to kind of swing a little bit. And that's why you might argue for a guy like Castle over Devin Carter. But if you look at Devin Carter and you look at some of the stuff he does analytically and his rebounding and all that stuff, it's also not the craziest thing in the world. And when you go, well, could he be the 6th best player in the draft 5 years from now? It's like, yeah, I think he could, like, especially when there's so much mystery and with so many of the prospects, and you're betting so much on upside. And sometimes when you take upside swings, no matter the circumstance, you might swing and miss sometimes, because sometimes you could be swinging in the dirt. So yeah, I think that's an interesting kind of thought process, because if there's one thing we know, the draft is unpredictable. They don't care. The draft doesn't care about what mock drafts say. They're gonna throw some chaos at us. Albert and I were in the at the draft in person when Primo got taken.
That's true.
There was a lot of stuff that happened that night that we were like, oh, that was an interesting decision. So I think draft night's going to be really fun. Jeremy, appreciate you coming on again, chopping it up, spending time, just breaking down your thought process, basketball, everything that you do. Tell the lovely people around the World Wide Web where they can find you and what you got going on.
Yeah. ESPN.com. Gavoni and I are writing basically every day something. So there will be a lot more updates to come between now and 2 weeks from now. So thanks, guys, for having me. It's always fun.
ESPN, guys, maybe you've heard of it. The worldwide leader. Albert, tell the people where they can find you.
You can find me at Alberto Gim on Twitter, at GTGNBA on Instagram is where you could find me. And this was a lot of fun. Really appreciate you coming on, Jeremy. It's always great to talk and to, get different perspective. Because, Corey and I, it's funny. We get a lot of crap because we think alike a lot of times and we agree a lot and people hate that. But it's great to have someone on, to give us different perspective time to time. And I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, anytime.
Yeah. You find me at Corey Talbot. You can find all of our work at NoCeilingsNBA.com. You'll find all the links there, podcast, all that stuff. Thank you for everybody watching live. Thank you for everybody listening on the podcast feed. Appreciate you all. A lot of stuff coming every day at NoCeilingsNBA.com, from video to audio to written work to social content. Some people might think it's even engagement farming, apparently. But, what are you going to do? We're trying to bring you guys a good experience and get you caught up on the draft. So until next time, everybody, we love you all. We're out. Peace.
Peace.